Welcome to the Wills and Estate Transmission Podcast, brought to you by De Groots, specialist lawyers in wills and estates.
Hi, and welcome to the podcast channel for degroots.com.au, our Wills and Estates Transmission. And today we're joined by Kate Varcoe. How are you, Kate?
I'm very well, thank you, Tony. And yourself?
Excellent. Today we are talking about bequests. And we're talking about particularly because you were recently, and my pronunciation you've already challenged me on, so I'm going to get it wrong anyway. You recently spoke on a panel at QAGOMA, Gallery of Modern Art in Queensland recently. Was that the right pronunciation?
Very close, QAGOMA.
QAGOMA.
But we're just going to talk about it as the Gallery of Modern Art or GOMA for today.
Okay,
GOMA. To make life easier for everyone.
Queensland GOMA, there we go.
Yes.
And I have been there. We were talking about the structures and everything. It's really nice. It's amazing, right on the riverbank right there. So on what basis were you on the panel of speakers, and what topic were you actually presenting on?
Yeah, so I'm a future collective member of QAGOMA, and that's an opportunity for younger members, I suppose, to become involved in the arts, particularly the modern arts. And as a part of that, and also being a lawyer, I was invited to speak on a panel for an event called The Art of the Bequest. And that's an event that they usually put on once a year. And the purpose of that is to construct a panel which is comprised of different people to provide different perspectives about making bequests or contributing to the arts as it particularly pertains to GOMA, but more broadly as it pertains to bequests. So we talk about how bequests are made, the tricks and traps, of which there are many, right through to how institutions such as GOMA or any other charity administers bequests that are made to them under a will or any donations that are made to them. So part of my role was putting on my legal hat and talking about the legal challenges that can occur in making bequests.
Yeah, and there are quite a few traps around making bequests to institutions. There's some things you can donate to. I think it's like building funds and whatever. But admin funds is something else, and
correct.
There's different rules around all of that. So,
yes.
Can you talk some of the different types of bequests and some considerations for making a bequest to a public institution like GOMA?
Yeah, well, I suppose taking a step back in terms of what a bequest might look like, if we're thinking about our wills, and I'll try and keep this part of it simple. We can make a bequest by way of a pecuniary legacy. So that's really just a sum of money that is left to a charitable institution. You can leave an individual item or some other form of asset. It could be a house, it could be some shares to that institution. Occasionally I've seen the residue of an estate left to a charity. So the residue is essentially the balance of all of your estate that you hold personally that you haven't specifically dealt with earlier in your will. An issue with that is, of course, that the residue can literally include the kitchen sink, and most charities are not overly enthused about receiving all of those things. We'll talk about tax later because I think that you might have been hinting at that. But I think the takeaway is to think about if you'd like to make a bequest to a particular charity, turn your mind to the way in which that institution might purposefully use that bequest.
Yeah, and you're right talking about the kitchen sink and whatever, because I know that institutions and charities don't like objects as such, because objects require looking after and disposing of. Even, a piece of art requires all sorts of things.
Yes.
But I guess an institution like GOMA would be okay with getting objects such as art and what have you.
It certainly could be. I would always encourage someone that felt that they may have a piece of art to talk to the relevant institution that they may be thinking of bequesting that art to, or bequeathing it to, shall I say, simply because there is a lot of thinking that goes behind how to curate a gallery such as QAGOMA. And so it's really good to have that open discussion as to whether or not it's a piece of art they may be interested in, or if not, they could potentially be directed towards another charity or institution.
Mm. So is that part of the different types of bequests that you can make, or you...
It certainly is, but you do need to think about it's an asset. It needs to be maintained, and there needs to be a level of upkeep. So potentially you could also think about setting aside a certain fund, or at least donating a certain pecuniary legacy to assist in the upkeep. But certainly in some situations it is, there is no reason why you wouldn't make a bequest of a particular asset if it was appropriate in the circumstances. But always keep that line of communication open with the bequest officer as to how that might work.
Okay, so having a look at, you can make a bequest or try to make a bequest towards a certain program.
Yes.
And that, again, that would be common in relation to institutions and what have you. They might have a program for art for young people, or modern art, or I'm an abstract painter. It might be an abstract gallery that you want it to go towards. But it's pretty important to be flexible with that.
Yeah, so look, I think I speak for most charities that at the end of the day, their ideal bequest or gift would be in the form of money, essentially.
Makes sense.
To be frank,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it allows them to do what they consider to be best in terms of utilising or maximising that gift that they've received. Because as you pointed out, there may be a number of funds that collectively form part of the charitable exercise that they're involved in, and those funds could be put to better use if they can direct them in certain areas, if I can put it that way. If gifts are made with conditions on them that can't be fulfilled, there are issues there in terms of them lapsing, and certainly it creates an administrative toll, if I can put it that way, on institutions if they have conditions or uses for bequests that are made, because they essentially have to set up, if you can think of it as a form of sub-fund. So every time they're administering or getting together to make decisions about what to do with the pool of funds that they have available to them, if there are lots of sub-funds sitting under that pool that sits on top of them, then they're essentially taking off their hats every time they're making decisions about how to utilise every single different pool if they've been set up for a particular purpose. And then you also need to think about the extent to which a fund can be utilised if you want it to be set up for a particular purpose, and whether or not it's actually going to be alive as long as you think it might be. So you need to think carefully and thoroughly through those sorts of issues.
Well, I think if your surname was Fairfax and you wanted to establish a new wing for GOMA, I think they'd let you do that.
They may do that. Mr. Fairfax is heavily involved in QAGOMA and is a great benefactor. So he is one of those people who would have to make decisions about how the funds are spent. And there's a lot of thought, I know, particularly with that institution, that goes around wishes that have been expressed by people who have bequeathed money or assets to them. So I think that's good to know as well. And again, I go back to keeping that level of communication open with bequest officers, because that does filter through to the decisions that are made ultimately by board members.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have an inheritance tax in Australia yet. And that's how a lot of institutions overseas have collected pieces and what have you, is to avoid paying tax.
Yes.
Good idea. All right. So while we're referring to that, So it's important to direct any monies or anything to the correct
Yeah.
entity, and
Yeah.
that advice is sought in advance. And I guess from the institution itself, because we were talking before about building funds, admin funds, and it can get quite complex.
Correct. So yeah, certainly that's one of the big takeaways from today. If you're thinking about making a bequest, whether it be or a donation during your lifetime, just make sure it's going to the right place. It's in terms of war stories that we see in practice,
Mm,
they are numerous. In fact,
mm,
probably countless.
mm,
When it comes to looking at a will where the beneficiary that has been named either doesn't exist
mm,
or the purpose that has been described for which the bequest is to be utilised doesn't necessarily equate with the charity that's been named. So there's a lot of thought and investigative work that needs to be done either by the lawyer or by the testator, the person making the will, to make sure that the funds that they are bequeathing end up in the right place. So just a couple of examples would be, and this is just one that we were able to resolve informally. Religious institutions, may I just say, are serial offenders in this regard. And I don't mean to be overly critical, but only because
that's
that
it.
they have
Mm,
evolved over time, and there are so many funds and
mm,
arms to their overall organisation
mm,
that exist for different purposes. And so they can be a bit tricky to navigate. So
mm.
always pick up the phone and have a chat to someone at the other end. But we did have a will fairly recently, which we resolved. Typical situation in which the testator um, didn't have any immediate family, was very wealthy, left shares, a large parcel of shares, to an entity with an ABN next to the entity for a described purpose for which those funds were to be applied for or used for. Now, the entity itself didn't correlate with the ABN. The ABN did exist or was attached to a different entity which did exist, but it wasn't the entity described in the will. And the purpose for which the funds were to be used didn't equate with certainly the entity
Uh,
named, but could potentially, if we were being a bit generous, apply to the entity which attached to the ABN. So, look, we managed to resolve that. And as you would appreciate, and I think we'll probably get to, um, there were different tax status um, which applied to the charity named to begin with, the charity that was connected with the ABN, and the purpose, which was to go towards a particular hospital and its operations. And so there was the desire to direct those funds to the correct fund, the fund
mm.
which had DGR status.
Yeah, you beat me to it. I was going to mention the ABN issue because that's not uncommon.
Yes. So would always suggest if you are making a will, and as lawyers, make sure the entity exists itself to start off with. Have a look at the ABN, make sure that correlates. And then if you have a look at ABN lookup, that will say whether or not the entity and the ABN both correlate and the exact status that they have,
Mm,
whether
great.
as a charity or a DGR or something else.
Thank you. So we're going to run out of time in this
Yep,
episode, but we'll come back and discuss the tax implications. I know you
sure.
really want to do that. I know you're looking forward to
I am.
it. We will do that one. So can you just give us a really quick recap?
Really quick recap is a lot of people are interested in giving, whether during their lifetime or upon death. It's not as simple as some people may think if they wish to bequeath something via their will, to make sure that the gift that they intend to end up to the correct charity for the correct purpose in the most tax effective manner often actually occurs. And so it takes some careful consideration definitely would suggest you go and seek specialist advice on the issue from a lawyer. And I think that probably wraps up where we've got to for now. And I can't wait, very sadly, to talk about tax in our next session.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that.
All right then.
Thanks for listening today. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you require any further information, please go to our website www.degroots.com.au and book a consultation. The contents of this podcast do not constitute legal advice and are of a general nature only. Listeners should make their own inquiries about their specific circumstances and seek legal advice.